At 18, Evan Mercer owned $43, a worn duffel bag, and a future nobody seemed to believe in. The foster care system had done everything it was required to do. It had fed him, housed him, moved him from one family to another, and finally handed him a thin folder containing everything anyone knew about his life. Then it let him go. 3 weeks later, after sleeping in parks and washing his clothes in gas station sinks, Evan found himself standing in a small town he had never heard of before. Redstone Hollow, population 4,012. The place looked forgotten. Faded storefronts lined the main street. A diner sat on the corner beside a hardware store that seemed older than the road itself. The courthouse lawn was covered with community flyers curling in the wind. One flyer stopped him. County tax auction. 12 properties. Most were empty lots. One was an abandoned fire station on Ashwood Road. Minimum bid, $10. Evan should have kept walking. A person with $19 left to his name had no business buying a ruined building. But something about the listing held his attention. The next morning, he sat in the back row of folding chairs as local investors purchased properties one after another. When the fire station came up, nobody raised a hand. The clerk asked again. Silence. Then Evan lifted his. $10. Sold. The old station looked worse up close. Broken windows, water-stained walls, collapsed ceiling tiles, years of neglect. Yet deep inside the building, hidden behind 6 rusted lockers bolted against a wall that didn't belong, Evan would discover something nobody had seen in years. A concealed steel door. A sealed office. A room filled with photographs, journals, and secrets. And waiting among them was a letter addressed to a boy who had vanished 18 years earlier, a boy named Evan Mercer. The station had been waiting for him. The people inside its walls had been waiting for him. And before the story was over, Evan would discover the truth about his parents, inherit a legacy worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and find the one thing he had spent his entire life searching for: home. The caseworker's office smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. Evan Mercer sat across from a metal desk while sunlight filtered through the blinds behind her. A cardboard box of tissues sat between them. She kept pushing it closer. Evan ignored it. He wasn't crying. He wasn't angry either. Mostly, he felt tired. 18 today, the woman said gently. Evan nodded. The words carried more weight than a birthday ever should. 18 meant adulthood. It also meant the state no longer had responsibility for him. No more foster placements. No more temporary homes. No more system. The woman slid a thin manila folder across the desk. This is everything we have. Evan looked down. Everything? His entire life fit inside something thinner than a magazine. He opened it. A birth certificate. No father listed. Mother: Juliet Mercer. Status: deceased. There was a photograph, a faded picture of a toddler sitting on a linoleum floor. The child stared away from the camera. One hand reached toward the edge of the frame. Evan had carried that photograph for years. It was the only picture of himself that existed. The rest of the file contained intake records, medical forms, and placement histories. 7 foster homes. 7 endings. No explanations. No details. Just dates. The caseworker handed him an envelope. Inside was a check. $43. Your remaining allowance balance. Evan stared at the number. $43. That was the final total assigned to his childhood. He folded the check and slipped it into his wallet. Then he picked up his duffel bag. Everything he owned fit inside. 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a phone charger, and a paperback novel missing its cover. Do you have somewhere to go? The caseworker asked. Evan looked toward the window. Outside, people moved through the parking lot carrying groceries and coffee cups. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. Yeah, he lied. The first night, he slept behind a shopping center. The second night, he slept under a picnic shelter in a public park. By the end of the first week, he had learned which gas stations stayed open all night and which security guards checked behind buildings. By the second week, his money was disappearing faster than he could replace it. Bread, peanut butter, water, bus fares. Each purchase made the future smaller. He washed his clothes in a gas station sink at 2 a.m. and dried them under a hand dryer. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked questions. The third week was worse. His phone died. Without money to charge it, he lost access to shelter listings and food programs. One afternoon, he walked 12 blocks to a soup kitchen, only to discover it had moved locations. Standing on the empty sidewalk, he realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had said his name out loud. That evening, he started walking, not toward anything, just away. A truck driver picked him up at a rest stop south of the city. The man didn't ask questions. He simply turned up the radio and drove. Hours later, the truck stopped beside a weathered sign. Welcome to Redstone Hollow. Population 4,012. Evan climbed down with his duffel bag and thanked the driver. The truck disappeared around a bend in the road. For a moment, he stood alone. Then his eyes landed on a bulletin board outside the courthouse. A bright yellow flyer fluttered in the wind. County tax auction, Saturday, 10 a.m. And at the very bottom of the list sat one final property, former fire station number 7. Minimum bid, $10. Evan read the line twice, then a third time. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Friday night was cold. Evan spent it lying beneath the overhang of a closed gas station on the edge of town. His duffel bag served as a pillow. The auction flyer rested inside his jacket pocket. Every few minutes, he pulled it out and read the final line again. Former fire station number 7. Minimum bid, $10. The idea made no sense. He had $19 left. Buying an abandoned building would leave him with $9 and a structure he couldn't heat, couldn't repair, and probably couldn't legally live in. Any reasonable person would walk away. But as the night stretched on, Evan found himself thinking about something else. A roof, 4 walls, a place that wouldn't disappear when morning came. By sunrise, he had made his decision. The courthouse lawn was already crowded when he arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a small platform where a county clerk stood behind a microphone. Most of the people attending looked familiar with one another. They shook hands, shared coffee, talked about property lines and market values. Evan sat alone in the back row. The auction began. One property after another sold quickly. An empty lot, a condemned house, an old storage building. The bidders raised their paddles without hesitation. Money seemed easy for them. For Evan, every dollar felt heavy. Finally, the clerk reached the last item on the list. Property 12, she announced. Former fire station number 7 on Ashwood Road. Approximately 4,000 square feet. Structural deterioration noted. Water damage present. Minimum bid, $10. Silence. Nobody moved. The clerk looked over the crowd. Do I have $10? Still nothing. A woman near the front shook her head. Someone laughed quietly. The building clearly had a reputation. $10? The clerk asked again. Evan raised his hand. Every head turned toward him. For a moment, he wished he hadn't moved. The attention felt uncomfortable. The clerk blinked. $10 from the young man. She waited. Do I hear 15? Nobody answered. A long pause settled over the crowd. Then the gavel came down. Sold. Just like that, Evan Mercer became the owner of a fire station. The paperwork took less than 10 minutes. He handed over a wrinkled $10 bill. The clerk gave him a key attached to a plain metal ring. As she slid the deed across the counter, she studied him carefully. You know what you're getting into. No, Evan admitted. To his surprise, she smiled. Good luck. The station sat 3 blocks from Main Street. When Evan finally reached it, he understood why nobody else had bid. The building looked abandoned even by abandoned building standards. 2 massive bay doors stood partially open. Most of the windows were broken. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete. Rain had stained the brick walls dark brown in places. The station seemed forgotten, left behind. A little like him. Evan stood on the cracked concrete pad and stared at it. Then he slipped the key into the front lock. The mechanism groaned before finally turning. Inside, the air smelled of dust, rust, and old water. Sunlight poured through broken windows. The truck bay stretched across most of the building. Collapsed ceiling tiles littered the floor. Puddles reflected patches of light. Yet beneath the damage, something caught Evan's attention. The structure itself was solid. The steel beams overhead showed only surface rust. The concrete floor remained level. The brick walls stood straight. The building wasn't dying. It had simply been abandoned. For the rest of the afternoon, Evan worked. He found an old push broom in a utility closet. Broken glass disappeared into piles. Trash bags filled with debris. Standing water slowly drained after he unclogged a floor drain using a bent piece of wire. By evening, he had cleared a small corner of the truck bay. 10 feet by 10 feet. Nothing impressive. But it was his. He spread out his sleeping bag and sat against the wall. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't worrying about where security guards might find him. No one could tell him to leave. No one could lock the door behind him. As darkness settled over the station, Evan explored the back hallway. A kitchen, a bunk room, a bathroom. Then, at the very rear of the building, he found something unusual. 6 red steel lockers stood bolted tightly against the far wall. The lockers looked older than everything else, almost deliberately placed. Evan opened each one. Empty. Dust. Old hangers. Nothing worth noticing. Until he stepped back. The wall behind them didn't match the rest of the station. Everywhere else, the building used red brick. Behind the lockers stood gray cinder block. A different wall. A newer wall. Slowly, Evan approached. He pressed his hand against the cold surface. Then he knocked. Most of the wall sounded solid, but near the far corner, the sound changed. Hollow. Evan froze. He dropped to one knee and looked beneath the lockers. A narrow gap separated the wall from the floor, and through that gap came something impossible. A steady stream of cool air. There was space behind the wall, a hidden space. And for the first time since arriving in Redstone Hollow, Evan felt something stronger than uncertainty. Curiosity. Someone had built that wall for a reason, and suddenly he needed to know what was hiding behind it. Evan barely slept that night. The steady hum of wind moving through broken windows echoed across the fire station, but his thoughts stayed fixed on the wall behind the lockers. A hidden space. A sealed room. Someone had gone through considerable effort to conceal it. Why? Morning arrived, gray and cool. Sunlight filtered through the shattered windows and cast long stripes across the truck bay floor. Evan ate the last slice of bread from his backpack while staring toward the rear hallway. The lockers weren't moving themselves. He needed tools. Crossing the street, he entered the hardware store he had noticed the day before. A brass bell jingled above the door. The store smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and old wood. Every shelf seemed packed with decades of inventory. Behind the register stood a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his forehead. The man looked up. "Help you?" "I need a socket wrench," Evan said, "and maybe a pry bar." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you working on?" "The fire station." Recognition immediately crossed his face. "You're the kid who bought it." Evan nodded. The man walked around the counter. "Name's Calvin Boone. Evan Mercer." Calvin led him down an aisle filled with tools. He selected a socket set and handed it over. Evan turned the box around. $24. More money than he had. "I only have 9. Calvin studied him for several seconds. Then he shrugged. "Bring it back when you're done." Evan blinked. "What?" Tools no good sitting on a shelf. Before Evan could respond, Calvin disappeared into a back room and returned with a paper bag. He placed it beside the toolbox. "Turkey sandwich. Coffee." "I can't pay for this." "I didn't ask you to." For a moment, Evan didn't know what to say. People rarely gave him anything without paperwork attached. "Thank you." Calvin waved him away. "Just bring the tools back." Back at the station, Evan got to work. The locker row had been bolted into the concrete decades earlier. Rust coated every fastener. Several refused to move, but persistence accomplished what strength couldn't. One bolt, then another, then another. Hours passed. Sweat soaked through his shirt. Metal screeched against concrete. Finally, the last locker broke free. Evan dragged it aside. The entire wall was exposed. And there it was, a steel door, hidden behind the lockers. Painted red long ago, but faded now to dull rust. Across the center, barely visible beneath years of dust, were 2 words. "Chief's office." Evan's pulse quickened. The handle refused to turn. Locked. The auction key didn't fit. For several moments, he simply stood there, staring. Someone had hidden an entire office, then sealed it shut. The pry bar slid into the gap between the frame and the door. Evan leaned his weight against it. Nothing. He tried again. Metal groaned. Dust drifted from above. A third attempt produced a sharp crack. The lock finally gave way. The door swung inward. Cool air rushed out, air that hadn't touched the rest of the building in years. The room beyond was perfectly preserved. Evan stepped inside. The office looked frozen in time. A metal desk stood against the far wall. 2 filing cabinets flanked it. A rolling chair sat pushed back as though someone had just stood up moments ago. Photographs covered the walls. Firefighters. Community events. Group portraits. Awards. Certificates. A calendar still hung behind the desk. The date displayed was 8 years old. Dust coated every surface evenly. No footprints. No disturbance. Nobody had entered since the room was sealed. On the desk lay a thick leather journal. Evan carefully opened it. The first pages contained routine station records, maintenance schedules, training logs, equipment inspections. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed something. Certain entries carried a small star in the margin. Those pages were different. Names, dates, dollar amounts. March 12th. Emergency rent assistance. July 8th. Medical expenses covered. November 2nd. Funeral costs paid. The entries continued for years. Someone had quietly helped people throughout the town, without recognition, without publicity, without taking credit. The deeper Evan read, the more one name appeared throughout the journal. Walter Hensley, fire chief, community leader, keeper of records. Then, several pages later, 2 unfamiliar names began appearing again and again. Circled. Underline. Mentioned with unusual care. Nathan Mercer. Juliet Mercer. Evan stared at the names. Something about them felt important. The entries surrounding them carried a weight unlike the others. He turned another page, then another. And slowly, a feeling began to settle in his chest. For the first time since opening the journal, he wasn't reading about strangers. Somehow, these names were connected to him. He just didn't know how yet. Evan sat alone in the hidden office long after the afternoon sunlight had shifted across the room. The station around him was silent. Dust floated through narrow beams of light that slipped past the small office window. The leather journal remained open on the desk. Nathan Mercer. Juliet Mercer. The names appeared everywhere. Walter Hensley mentioned them more often than anyone else. Sometimes entire pages focused on them. Nathan repaired the station roof after a storm. Juliet organized first aid training for new volunteers. Nathan built shelving units for the equipment room. Juliet stayed overnight at the clinic after a highway accident and still reported for volunteer duty the next morning. Walter's admiration was impossible to miss. The entries were filled with pride, respect, affection. One passage stopped Evan completely. Nathan and Juliet are the kind of people every community hopes for and rarely deserves. Evan read the sentence twice, then a third time. Something inside him tightened. The surname, Mercer. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? He turned more pages. The journal entries eventually changed. The handwriting became heavier. The sentences shorter, more emotional. Walter was no longer documenting station life. He was grieving. October 14th. The date appeared repeatedly. One page contained only a single sentence. 14 children came home today because Nathan and Juliet did not. Evan's heartbeat quickened. He continued reading. The story slowly emerged. A fire at Cedar Ridge Elementary School. An electrical fault. Heavy smoke. Children trapped on the second floor. Volunteer firefighters responding. Nathan and Juliet entering first. Child after child brought to safety. Then, disaster. The stairwell collapsed. Neither firefighter made it back out. Evan stared at the words. The office suddenly felt smaller, quieter. The silence pressed against him. Walter's grief filled every line. Yet another detail kept appearing. A baby. An infant son, 6 months old. Walter never wrote the child's name. Only the boy. The boy deserved to know. The boy deserves his parents' story. The boy must be found. Evan's hands grew cold. He slowly rose from the chair. The filing cabinets stood against the wall. Maybe there was more. The first cabinet contained station records, budgets, maintenance reports, insurance forms. Nothing personal. The second cabinet held correspondence, volunteer applications, community documents, years of paperwork. He searched drawer after drawer. Near the very bottom, hidden behind a stack of old folders, something caught his eye. A manila file. Unlike the others, it had been carefully labeled. The handwriting matched Walter's journal. Mercer Family Archive. Urgent. Evan froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he carefully removed the file and carried it to the desk. His pulse thundered in his ears. The folder felt heavier than paper should. Inside were 3 items. Nothing more, nothing less. The first was a photograph. A newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. A hospital identification card sat beside the infant. The image was faded but still clear. The baby had dark hair, tiny clenched fists, a face red from crying. Evan turned the photograph over. March 2006. Baby boy Mercer. He swallowed hard. The second item was a newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the top ran a headline. Local firefighters die saving children in school blaze. Beneath the headline were 2 photographs. A young man, a young woman, both smiling. Both wearing volunteer firefighter uniforms. Nathan Mercer, Juliet Mercer. Evan looked at them for a long time. He didn't know these people, yet somehow they felt familiar. The shape of Nathan's eyes, Juliet's smile, something about them echoed inside him. Then he reached for the final document, a larger newspaper article. One paragraph near the bottom had been highlighted in yellow. His eyes found the line immediately. Survived by their 6-month-old son, Evan Mercer. The room disappeared. The words seemed to stand alone on the page. Evan Mercer, his name, not similar. Not close. Exactly his name. His hands began to shake. Slowly, he removed the faded childhood photograph from his wallet. The only picture he had carried his entire life. The toddler sitting on a linoleum floor. He placed it beside the newspaper clipping, then beside the photograph of Nathan and Juliet. For the first time, he could see it. Nathan's eyes, Juliet's jawline. His face carried pieces of both. The truth hit him all at once. Nathan Mercer and Juliet Mercer were not strangers. They were his parents. The parents he had spent 18 years wondering about. The parents who had died, saving 14 children. The parents nobody had ever told him about. Tears filled his eyes before he realized he was crying. He sat back in Walter's chair and stared at the photographs. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the station. Inside the hidden office, Evan finally knew where he came from. But one question remained. If Walter knew all of this, why had he spent 18 years searching for him? Evan barely left the hidden office that night. The photographs remained spread across Walter Hensley's desk. Nathan Mercer, Juliet Mercer, his parents. For 18 years, they had existed only as empty spaces in his life. Questions without answers. Shadows without faces. Now they were real. Real people. Real heroes. And somehow, that made their absence hurt even more. He sat in Walter's chair long after darkness settled over the station. The old building creaked softly around him. Wind brushed against the brick walls. The silence felt different now, not empty, waiting. The next morning, Evan crossed the street to Boone Hardware and Supply. Calvin Boone was organizing paint cans when he walked in. The older man glanced up once and immediately stopped working. "You found something." It wasn't a question. Evan nodded. "I found Walter's office." Calvin slowly removed his glasses. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Calvin exhaled. "So you finally got inside. You knew it was there?" "Everybody knew it was there." Calvin leaned against a shelf. "Nobody knew how to open it after Walter sealed it up." Evan hesitated. "I found files." Calvin's expression softened. "About Nathan and Juliet?" Evan froze. The answer must have shown on his face. Calvin nodded quietly. "I thought so." For several moments, Evan couldn't find words. Finally, he asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Who were they?" Calvin looked toward the station across the street. "They were the best people I ever knew." The answer came without hesitation. "Nathan built half this town. Juliet took care of the other half." Evan listened. Nathan was a carpenter, could fix anything. Juliet was a nurse, smart, calm, never panicked. Calvin smiled faintly. They met at the station. The smile disappeared. They died saving those kids. The store fell quiet. Calvin folded his arms. Walter never got over it. Why was he looking for me? The older man looked directly at him. Because you were all they had left. The words hit harder than Evan expected. Calvin remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke again. You need to talk to Evelyn. Evelyn? Walter's wife. Calvin pointed down the street. 3 blocks east. White cottage. Rose bushes out front. Will she know who I am? A sad smile crossed Calvin's face. Son, if you look anything like Nathan, she'll know before you say your name. An hour later, Evan stood outside the small cottage. The chain-link fence leaned slightly. Rose bushes lined the walkway. A porch swing moved gently in the breeze. The house felt lived in, loved. He climbed the steps and knocked. Nothing happened. Then, slow footsteps approached. The door opened halfway. An elderly woman appeared. White hair, sharp blue eyes, thin frame. The moment she looked at him, her expression changed. Her hand tightened around the edge of the door. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then her eyes filled with tears. Oh my goodness. Her voice trembled. You have his eyes. Evan swallowed. Ma'am, my name is Evan Mercer. The words left her mouth before he finished speaking. He blinked. The woman nodded slowly. Nathan's eyes. She pressed one trembling hand against her chest. I would know them anywhere. For a moment, neither moved. Then the woman stepped aside. Come in. The cottage smelled of tea and old books. Photographs covered nearly every wall. Family gatherings, community picnics, firefighters, celebrations, life. Evelyn led him into the kitchen. A kettle sat on the stove. She filled 2 mugs and lowered herself carefully into a chair. Evan sat across from her. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, studying him, memorizing him. Finally, she smiled through her tears. Walter was right. Evan frowned. About what? She wrapped both hands around her mug. He always said you would come back someday. The room suddenly felt very still. He spent 18 years looking for you. Evan stared at her. 18 years? Every year. Every lead. Every rumor. Every possibility. Her eyes drifted toward the window. He called state agencies, wrote letters, hired investigators. Why? The answer came instantly. Because he loved your parents. The simplicity of it made Evan's throat tighten. Evelyn reached into a nearby drawer. She pulled out an old photograph. Nathan and Juliet stood together outside the fire station. Young. Happy. Alive. You should know something, she said softly. Evan looked up. Your parents talked about you every chance they got. The tears returned to her eyes. Nathan built your nursery himself. A smile appeared. Juliet painted stars on the ceiling. Evan looked down at the photograph. His vision blurred. For the first time in his life, someone was telling him stories about the people who had loved him before he could remember. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. There is one more thing Walter left behind. Evan looked up. What thing? Evelyn held his gaze. A key. And suddenly, every mystery surrounding Walter Hensley felt one step closer to being solved. Evan hardly slept that night. The photograph Evelyn had given him sat on Walter Hensley's desk beside the newspaper clipping and the faded picture from his wallet. 3 photographs. 3 pieces of a life he had never known. For years, he had imagined what his parents might have been like. Sometimes he pictured them as ordinary people who had simply disappeared. Sometimes he imagined they had chosen not to look for him. Now he knew the truth. Nathan and Juliet Mercer had never abandoned him. They had died saving children. An old fire chief had spent nearly 2 decades trying to bring their son home. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the station carrying a small leather purse. She moved slowly through the truck bay, her cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. Sunlight streamed through the broken windows behind her. Evan met her at the entrance to the hidden office. For a moment, she simply stood there, looking around. The photographs, the filing cabinets, Walter's chair. The room looked exactly as her husband had left it. 8 years had passed since Walter's death. Yet it felt as though he might walk through the door at any moment. Evelyn wiped her eyes. He spent more time in this room than he did at home. A faint smile crossed her face. He always said the station belonged to everyone. She slowly approached the desk. Then she pointed downward. The safe is still there. Evan followed her gaze. Bolted beneath the desk sat a gray steel safe about the size of a microwave. He had noticed it before, but hadn't been able to open it. There was no handle, only a keyhole. Evelyn reached into her purse. For several seconds, she searched quietly. Then she pulled out a thin silver chain. A brass key hung from the end. The metal was worn smooth. Years of handling had polished it bright. Walter's key. Evelyn held it carefully. He gave this to me 3 weeks before he died. Her voice trembled. He told me to keep it until the boy came. Evan stared at the key. The boy. Walter had spent 18 years believing that one day he would arrive, and somehow, against all odds, he had. Evelyn pressed the key into his hand. I think he's been waiting long enough. The room fell silent. Evan knelt in front of the safe. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. Slowly, he inserted the key. The lock resisted at first. Then came a sharp click. The safe door swung open. Inside sat 3 items. Nothing more. Nothing less. A brown leather document folder, a thick manila envelope, and a sealed white envelope with yellowed wax across the flap. Written neatly across the front were 2 words, Evan Mercer. His throat tightened. He carefully removed everything and placed it on the desk. The leather folder came first. Inside was a property deed. Evan unfolded it. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he froze. The document showed that Walter Hensley had purchased Redstone Fire Station No. 7 12 years earlier. $22,000, paid in full. The station had never belonged to the county after that purchase. Walter had owned it outright. Evan continued reading. Near the bottom was a handwritten trust provision, the designated beneficiary upon Walter's death. Evan Mercer. For several seconds he couldn't breathe. The tax auction, the abandoned station, the $10 purchase. None of it had happened by accident. Walter had already left the property to him. The station had been waiting. Evelyn sat heavily in Walter's chair. He always said the station would find you. Evan opened the second envelope. Bank records spilled across the desk. Statements, contribution logs, trust agreements. The account title read, The Hensley Community Trust. His eyes dropped to the most recent balance, $327,418.62. Evan blinked, then looked again. The number didn't change. More than $300,000. The deposits stretched back decades. Small amounts, $20. $50, $100, pancake breakfasts, community fundraisers, charity events, volunteer contributions, thousands of acts of generosity slowly building into one extraordinary gift. Every firefighter had contributed. Every community event had mattered, and Walter had protected it all for him. Evan's hands trembled as he reached for the final envelope, the one bearing his name. The wax seal cracked softly beneath his thumb. Inside were 2 handwritten pages. Walter's handwriting. Steady, careful, intentional. Evan unfolded the letter, then began reading aloud. Dear Evan, if you are reading this, then somehow you found your way home. His voice caught immediately. Across the desk, tears filled Evelyn's eyes. Evan swallowed hard and continued. The first line alone told him something he had never truly believed before. He had not been forgotten. And whatever Walter had written next was about to change his life forever. Evan sat in Walter Hensley's chair and continued reading. The office was silent, except for the faint rustle of paper. Across from him, Evelyn listened with tears shining in her eyes. Walter's letter filled 2 pages, yet every line carried the weight of 18 years. Dear Evan, if you are reading this, then somehow you found your way home. I don't know how old you'll be when this letter reaches you. I don't know what kind of life you've had. What I do know is this. Your parents loved you more than words can explain. Evan paused. The lump in his throat returned. He swallowed and kept reading. Walter described Nathan as the finest carpenter he had ever known, and Juliet as the bravest medic to serve at the station. He wrote about pancake breakfasts, charity drives, fire drills, and long evenings when the volunteers sat together after calls. He wrote about how Nathan carried photographs of his son in his wallet, how Juliet never stopped talking about the future she imagined for her baby boy. Then came the part that broke Evan completely. I want you to understand something. Your parents did not die because they were unlucky. They died because there were children trapped inside a burning building, and they refused to leave those children behind. Every one of those children survived because of them. Evan lowered the page. For several seconds, he couldn't continue. No one had ever spoken about his parents before, not once. Now he was hearing their story, from a man who had loved them like family. Finally, he forced himself onward. Walter described years spent searching. Phone calls, letters, investigators, dead ends, hope, disappointment, then hope again. I never stopped looking for you. I promised your parents that if anything happened to them, this station would always remember their son. Evan wiped his eyes. The final paragraph felt almost like a conversation. I cannot give you back the years that were taken from you. I cannot give you back your mother and father, but I can give you what they earned through the way they lived. The station, the trust, and the knowledge that you were loved from the very beginning. Use these gifts well. Help people when you can. Protect what matters, and become the kind of man your parents would recognize. The letter ended simply, Walter Hensley. Evan folded the pages carefully. Neither he nor Evelyn spoke for several minutes. Some moments were too important for words. The next morning, he walked to Pioneer Valley Bank. The building sat near the courthouse. Brick exterior, white columns, a small American flag moving in the breeze. The bank manager, Andrew Keller, spent nearly half an hour reviewing the trust documents. He checked signatures, county records, identification. Then he finally looked up. Mr. Mercer, everything appears to be in order. Evan sat quietly. The sentence felt unreal. Andrew slid a statement across the desk. Current balance, $327,418.62. Evan stared at the number. 3 weeks earlier, he had owned $43. Now he controlled more money than he had ever imagined. What would you like to do? Evan thought for a moment, then shook his head. Leave it where it is. The manager smiled. A wise answer. Evan withdrew only $200 for immediate expenses. The rest remained untouched. The fund had taken 40 years to build. He wasn't about to waste it. When he returned to the station that afternoon, something unexpected was waiting. A black SUV sat parked beside the curb. A man stood beside it, late 50s. Expensive suit, polished shoes, silver hair. The kind of person who looked completely out of place standing next to a neglected fire station. The man watched Evan approach. You the owner? Evan nodded. I am. The stranger handed him a business card. Victor Langford, Langford Development Group. I've been planning a redevelopment project in this area for 2 years. Evan glanced at the card. So? Victor pointed toward the station. This property is important to that project. Evan felt his stomach tighten. What kind of project? Retail space, apartments, parking. Victor smiled politely. The station sits in the middle of it. Evan looked back at the building, the truck bay, the hidden office, the photographs, Walter's desk. Everything he had discovered. Everything he had inherited. What does that have to do with me? Victor reached into his jacket. A checkbook appeared. I'll make this simple. He wrote a number, tore off the check, held it out. $5,000. Evan stared at it. $5,000 for a building he had bought for 10. A month ago, the offer would have changed his life. Now it felt different. The station wasn't just property anymore. It was his parents' story, Walter's legacy. His home. Victor waited, confident, certain of the outcome. Slowly, Evan handed the check back. The station isn't for sale. For the first time, Victor's smile disappeared, and the look in his eyes made one thing clear. This conversation wasn't over. Victor Langford returned 3 days later. This time, he didn't come alone. A dark sedan followed his SUV into the station parking area. A man in a gray suit stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase. Lawyer, Evan guessed immediately. He was patching a section of drywall near the old kitchen when he saw them arrive. The sight made his stomach tighten. Victor approached first. His expression remained calm, professional, confident. My attorney has reviewed the tax auction records. Evan climbed down from the ladder and wiped dust from his hands. Okay. There may be issues with the transfer of ownership, The attorney opened his briefcase. A petition has been filed, requesting a review of the property's title history. Victor folded his arms. If the county made procedural errors, ownership could revert. Evan looked from one man to the other. 3 weeks ago, the conversation would have terrified him. Now something felt different. He wasn't standing alone anymore. Walter had prepared for this. The trust documents were proof. Without saying a word, Evan walked past them. He entered the hidden office. Moments later, he returned carrying the leather document folder from Walter's safe. The attorney accepted it politely. Then he began reading. Several minutes passed. Victor's confidence slowly faded. The attorney reread multiple pages, examined signatures, compared dates. Finally, he closed the folder. The deed is valid. Victor frowned. What? The property was purchased outright by Walter Hensley 12 years ago. The attorney tapped the paperwork. The trust agreement is properly recorded. Victor's expression hardened. There has to be something. There isn't. The attorney handed the folder back. The ownership transfer is legal. Silence settled across the concrete pad. For the first time, Victor seemed uncertain. Evan could have left it there. The dispute was over. But something inside him told him there was more to this story. Back inside the office, he searched through Walter's records. Eventually, he found what he was looking for. A contribution ledger. Decades of handwritten entries. Names. Dates. Donations. He carried the ledger outside. Victor looked confused. What is that? Something Walter left behind? Evan opened the book on the hood of the SUV. Page after page documented contributions to the community fund. Then he stopped. A familiar surname appeared. Langford. He turned the book around. Victor leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. Samuel Langford. $50. Every month. For 22 years. Victor stared. That's my father. Evan nodded. According to Walter's records, your father volunteered at this station. The attorney quietly stepped back. The legal matter was no longer the important part. Evan turned another page. This ledger was different. Not donations. Distributions. Money given to people in need. Scholarships. Medical bills. Emergency assistance. His finger stopped beside one particular entry. September 1991. College tuition assistance. Recipient. Victor Langford. Authorized by Chief Walter Hensley. Victor went completely still. The color drained from his face. No. Evan pushed the ledger closer. It's right there. For a long moment, Victor simply stared. His father had donated to the fund for years, and the same fund had helped pay for his education. The station he wanted demolished had helped shape his future. I never knew. His voice was barely audible. Nobody did. Evan closed the ledger. Walter never wanted recognition. Victor sat heavily on the front steps of the station. The attorney quietly returned to his car. Neither man stopped him. For several minutes, Victor stared at the pavement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete. Finally, he spoke. My father died when I was 19. Evan listened. Heart attack after a volunteer call. Victor's eyes remained fixed on the ground. I left town after the funeral. The confession seemed difficult. I blamed this place. He looked toward the station. The memories. The silence stretched between them. Then Victor laughed bitterly. So I spent years trying to erase it. The words carried genuine regret, not anger. Regret. Evan sat beside him on the steps. Across the street, Calvin Boone watched from his store window, but wisely stayed inside. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Victor glanced toward the station. The open bay doors. The aging brick. The building that had survived decades. What are you going to do with it? Evan looked back at the structure. He thought about Nathan. Juliet. Walter. Evelyn. The hidden office. The trust. The community fund. The people who had quietly cared for one another long before he arrived. Then he answered, I'm going to bring it back. Victor slowly nodded. For the first time, there was no argument in his eyes, only understanding. As the sun dipped lower behind Redstone Hollow, Victor stood. I'll withdraw the petition tomorrow. Evan extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, Victor shook it. Then he walked toward his SUV. Halfway there, he stopped, turned back. My father would have wanted that station standing. Evan smiled faintly. I think Walter knew that. Victor nodded once. Then he drove away. That evening, Evan sat alone in Walter's office. The ledger rested open on the desk. He studied page after page. Hundreds of families. Hundreds of lives touched by quiet acts of generosity. The town deserved to know. The station deserved to be remembered. And suddenly, he knew exactly what he needed to do next. Tomorrow, Redstone Hollow was going to learn the truth about Walter Hensley's legacy. The next morning, Evan carried a stack of photocopies to the bulletin board outside the Redstone County Courthouse. The pages contained no opinions, no speeches, no explanations, only facts, names, dates, donations, assistance records. 40 years of entries copied directly from Walter Hensley's ledgers. Every dollar donated, every family helped, every act of quiet generosity. Evan pinned the pages to the board and walked away. By noon, half the town had seen them. By evening, people were talking about little else. The first visitor arrived the next morning. A woman in her 40s stepped cautiously into the station. She carried an old photograph in her hands. "My mother," she explained softly. Evan invited her inside. The woman pointed to one of the ledger entries. "Hospital assistance, 1998. We lost our insurance after my father got hurt." Her eyes filled with tears. "I never knew who paid the bill." She touched the page gently. "Now I do." The next visitor came an hour later, then another, and another. Each person carried a story. A mortgage saved from foreclosure. A funeral paid for during a difficult winter. A college tuition bill covered when no other options existed. The stories were different. The gratitude was the same. Walter had spent 4 decades helping people without asking for recognition. Now the town was finally learning the truth. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. People stopped seeing the fire station as an abandoned building. They started seeing it as a piece of themselves. The first volunteer arrived on a Saturday morning, a retired electrician named Ronald Pierce. He walked through the truck bay carrying a toolbox. "I heard the wiring needs help." Evan smiled. "It does." Ronald nodded. "Good." Then he got to work. The following week, a plumber arrived. A few days later, someone delivered replacement windows. The owner of the local garden center brought flowers and shrubs. Nobody asked for payment. Nobody expected recognition. They simply showed up, exactly the way Walter had, exactly the way Nathan and Juliet had. Every morning, Calvin Boone crossed the street carrying coffee and tools. Every afternoon, he taught Evan something new: how to frame walls, how to repair trim, how to replace damaged drywall, how to measure twice and cut once. "Your father hated crooked work," Calvin said one afternoon while checking a wall with a level. Evan laughed. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Calvin grinned. Nathan would tear out an entire wall if it was off by a 1/4 inch. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through the station. Not memories. Real laughter. Living laughter. The kind that belonged in a place like this. Meanwhile, Evelyn became a daily fixture. Each morning, she walked the 3 blocks from her cottage. Each afternoon, she sat in a folding chair near the truck bay. She corrected people's stories about Walter, shared memories about Nathan and Juliet, and occasionally reminded everyone that she was still capable of bossing them around. One day, Evan showed her a room he had been quietly renovating in the rear section of the station. Fresh drywall, a small kitchenette, new flooring, a bright window overlooking the side yard. Evelyn stood silently in the doorway. "What is this?" "A home." She looked confused. "For who?" Evan smiled. "For you." Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Don't start crying," he warned. "I'll cry if I want." They both laughed. The following week, Evelyn moved in. Within days, curtains appeared. Then, bookshelves. Then, framed photographs. The room transformed from an apartment into a home. Outside, the station continued changing. New windows replaced broken glass. Water service returned. The plumbing worked. The electrical system came back online. One evening, after a final inspection, Evan stood beside the main breaker panel. A small crowd had gathered. Calvin, Evelyn, Ronald, several volunteers. Everyone waited. Evan flipped the switch. For one breathless second, nothing happened. Then the lights came alive, one by one, across the truck bay, down the hallway, into the kitchen, into the bunk room. The station glowed for the first time in years. Cheers erupted Evelyn wiped away tears.
Calvin grinned.
Evan simply stood there, staring. The building looked different under proper light. Not abandoned.
Not forgotten. Alive.
Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Evan sat alone in Walter's office. A laptop rested on the desk. Using a small portion of the trust, he had enrolled in online college courses, structural engineering, business management. He wanted to learn how things were built, how communities worked, how legacies survived. Beside the laptop sat a new folder, the Walter Hensley Legacy Fund. The paperwork was complete. The community fund would continue quietly, just as Walter intended. The first application already waited for review. A single mother whose furnace had failed during winter. Evan read the file carefully. Then he picked up a pen. The first check issued by the new fund would leave the station tomorrow. Walter's work wasn't ending. It was beginning again. And outside the office window, the restored station stood glowing in the darkness, waiting for the next chapter of its story. Spring arrived slowly in Redstone Hollow. The trees along Main Street filled with fresh green leaves. Flower boxes appeared in shop windows. The long winter finally loosened its grip on the town. At Fire Station number 7, the transformation was impossible to ignore. 3 months earlier, the building had looked forgotten. Broken windows, collapsed ceilings, dust, and silence. Now sunlight reflected from newly installed glass. Fresh paint covered repaired walls. The truck bay doors opened smoothly. The plumbing worked. The lights stayed on. Most importantly, people had returned. The station was alive again. On a warm Saturday morning in May, Evan stood near the front entrance holding a brass plaque wrapped in a blanket. A small crowd had gathered on the concrete pad. Calvin Boone stood near the front. Ronald Pierce arrived carrying a folding chair. The garden center owner had brought flowers. Several families who had once received help from Walter's fund stood quietly together. Even Victor Langford was there. He remained near the back of the crowd, hands in his pockets, watching silently. Evelyn stood beside Evan. One hand rested on her cane. The other held his arm. "Ready?" she asked. Evan nodded. Together, they uncovered the plaque. The polished brass caught the sunlight. The crowd fell silent. The inscription read, "In memory of Nathan Mercer and Juliet Mercer, volunteer firefighters, who gave their lives on October 14th, while saving 14 children from the Cedar Ridge school fire. Their courage is remembered. Their legacy lives on." Beneath those words appeared 14 names, the children they had saved. Evan had found each one through old records and newspaper archives. Some still lived nearby. Others had moved away. But every name belonged there. Every life mattered. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Evelyn stepped forward. The crowd immediately quieted. Most people in town knew her. Many had known Walter. Few had ever heard her speak publicly. She rested one hand on the plaque, the other on her cane. Then she began. "Most of you know who Walter Hensley was." Heads nodded throughout the crowd. "He spent 40 years serving this town." Her voice remained steady. "But today isn't about Walter." She turned toward Evan. "It's about a promise." The crowd listened carefully. 18 years ago, Nathan and Juliet Mercer died saving children. Emotion briefly caught in her throat. They left behind a baby boy. Evan lowered his eyes. For 18 years, that boy grew up without knowing where he came from. The silence deepened. Most people assumed the story ended there. Evelyn shook her head. But Walter never believed that. A faint smile appeared. He spent 18 years searching for Nathan and Juliet's son. Several people exchanged surprised looks. He called agencies, wrote letters, followed leads. Her eyes filled with tears. And when he couldn't find the boy, he protected everything instead. She gestured toward the station. The building, the fund, the records, the memories. Her gaze settled on Evan. He believed the boy would find his way home. The words hung in the air. Then she pointed toward him. "This is Evan Mercer." The crowd turned. Some already knew. Others did not. "He is Nathan and Juliet's son." Several gasps rippled through the gathering. Evelyn smiled through her tears. "He found this station at a tax auction and bought it for $10. A few people laughed softly in disbelief. $10. She shook her head. Walter always said the station would find him. Her voice trembled. He was right.
For a moment, nobody moved.
Then someone started clapping.
The owner of the garden center.
A second person joined, then another. Soon, the entire crowd applauded, not loudly, not wildly, just respectfully. The kind of applause reserved for truth, for remembrance, for homecomings. Afterward, people stayed.
Children ran through the truck bay.
Families shared food. Calvin grilled hot dogs near the entrance. Victor quietly helped carry tables. Laughter filled the building. The station had become a gathering place once again, exactly as Walter intended. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Evan climbed the steel ladder leading to the roof. The sky glowed orange and purple above Redstone Hollow. Lights appeared one by one throughout town, warm squares shining in the darkness. Below him, Evelyn sat on the front steps reading a book beneath a small lamp. Across the street, Calvin locked the hardware store. He glanced up and waved. Evan waved back. Beside him rested 3 photographs. The faded picture from his wallet, Nathan and Juliet standing proudly outside the station, and a framed photograph of Walter Hensley smiling beside an old fire engine. Evan looked at them for a long time. 3 people connected by love. 3 people who had changed his life without ever asking for anything in return. For years, he had believed he was alone,
A forgotten child.
a name in a file, a person nobody wanted. Now he knew better. Walter had searched for him. Nathan and Juliet had loved him. An entire community had unknowingly helped build a future waiting for him. The trust fund, the station, the legacy.
None of it was really about money.
It was about belonging.
It was about people choosing not to let others fall.
The evening breeze moved gently across the roof. Below, light spilled from the station's open doorway onto the sidewalk. The brass bell above the entrance reflected the last rays of sunlight. Evan leaned back and looked across the town. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wondering where he would sleep tomorrow. He wasn't wondering who he belonged to. He wasn't running. He was home. And beneath him, the old fire station stood strong and steady. The door was open. The lights were on. And after 18 years, the boy everyone had been waiting for had finally come home.